to everyone out in Freedom Talk Land. Glad that you're joining us. If you're listening online, we're grateful for your presence. So it's been maybe, I don't know, y'all tell me, when was the last time I was here? I've slept a bit since then. Maybe a month? Something like that? Not long enough, right? You're like, already, can't they find someone else to come to? Been too long. That's what I was fishing for. So kind of you to say that. So any new folks to John 3:17 that have no clue as to who I am? That's okay. Several. Good. Well, welcome. Well, you're in for a great disappointment. But it's all right. It's not going to be the first, nor the last. But my name is Klay. I'm a grateful Christian. And I confess to you, I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. I always start with that. I work just up the road, Harding University. I'm a counselor, a therapist there. I've got about 30 years of clinical practice in therapy and alcohol drug recovery work. About 34 years as a football coach. I'm not coaching football right now. I'm not on the field anymore, but my early days. So there's a lot of overlap there. It's kind of odd to have those two things combined, but that's a little bit about my story. Worked at Baptist Hospital Recovery Center, the alcohol and drug rehab there for about 5 or 6 years before I went full-time at the university. Worked the counseling center there for the students, and then have a part-time private practice on the side kind of as well. Been connected with John 3:17 for a very, very long time, even back to before John 3:17 was even John 3:17. So my connection with my roots run very, very deep with this place, and my heart is certainly connected. So again, thank you. And if I haven't met you, in all seriousness, I'm grateful to be able to meet you for the first time tonight. So thank you much. We're coming off of this is cool, isn't it? I got to tell you a story. I've got 3 kids who are very old now. Don't know how that happened, but they are. And my youngest, we were driving up through the hills, I think between here and Batesville sometime, and driving along, and it was about this time. It was Christmas time. You know how kids do. I think she was 8 or 9 or something, not real sure, but from the back seat she goes, "Daddy." I said, "Yeah, what?" And she said, "Can we get one of them Jesus sets?" And I was like, I don't know what she's talking about. I said, "What?" "You know, one of them Jesus sets to put in the yard." And so it was, I think it's called what? The Nativity. In my world, it's now Jesus set, you know. From every time I see one, I go, "Oh, there's a neat little Jesus set." So I'm glad that we got a Jesus set out here. Hey, I hope you had a good Thanksgiving. We're coming right off the heels of Thanksgiving. It kind of informed my thoughts on the way up here, as I usually do, as I'm going trying to think of something to say. We just came off of the holiday of Thanksgiving. It's an interesting idea. It made me think of a few things. Hope y'all ate good. I'm almost positive you did, because you cooked here and had it here. I hope you were able to have some family come in, and I hope it was a good time. And I hope you got enough to eat. And it's usually the case. I was in Texas. My father's 95 years old, still rocking around. So I went and took him to my cousin's, and we had Thanksgiving there, and it was a good time. And I'm grateful that I can still do that. I'm not grateful that I have to drive to Abilene, Texas, to do that, but I'm grateful to be able to see him, spend a few days with the family. Thanksgiving, as you think about it, we were told growing up when we went to the, school, and of course school is, informed by a lot of propaganda, but one of those stories is that the European invaders brought us the idea of being thankful. Well, I don't really think that's the truth. I think we knew about thankfulness long before people, sailed over here and began to tell us. In fact, I think indigenous cultures of the world are inherently or bred with the idea of being thankful, because they're far more connected to the natural world as being a part of, just this big old circle of life. But they told us, it was something else, and I'm sure they were grateful to be off a boat, and they were grateful to maybe trade a few things and have something to eat. But the whole idea of being grateful or being in a state of thanksgiving certainly did not come from that encounter. In fact, it goes way, way, way back in time, I think. And so I started thinking about what would that actually be? I mean, what is it to be thankful? What is it to be grateful? And it occurred to me that I think one of the challenges that we have in this culture, in this time, in this place, not new to us, but it's one of the challenges that Thanksgiving gets too connected in a way to circumstances. Now, I said too connected, okay, which doesn't mean it's not connected at all. Okay, but if it gets too tightly connected to my circumstances, I run the risk of either finding myself being grateful or not being grateful. So again, it's an additional challenge to this world and this culture, is that we view things way too much as either or, kind of all or none. Now, this should relate to us because we spend a lot of our time living at the illusion of all or none. It's either 100 mile an hour this way or it's dead stop zero. Can you relate to that? Yeah, we fall into that, in the state of our being. So the culture kind of funnels us, into thinking that we are either grateful or not grateful, thankful or not thankful. And I want to at least offer for our consideration tonight that Thanksgiving is much more of an attitude or a kind of a state of being, okay, that is somehow internal, inherent. Does that make sense? It's just there. It's part of us. Not completely detached from circumstances, but not determined by circumstances. Because see, we're all in this process. We're all in this story of life. And it's not finished writing, is it? I mean, it is in process. The pen is still going. It's still forming words and ideas, and it's still drawing out and mapping out the story, what will eventually be the story of us. And so if you're like me and you've lived enough life, and you have, you've experienced at least something like this, where the very worst day of my life, the very worst day of my life might be the best thing ever happened to me. And how do you hold those two ideas together? The glue that holds that together, I think, is this idea of thankfulness or gratitude. And I want to look at that idea and at least tie into something that maybe in Scripture that, maybe will get us a little something to hold on to. The Scriptures will tell you that to be thankful in all circumstances. Have you heard that one? It's usually it was thrown at me as a young child if I was not being grateful, And so they would hit me over the head with this idea of gratitude or thanksgiving, usually if I was what they at least thought to be ungrateful. But if you think about that message, how would it possibly come about to be thankful or to be grateful in all circumstances? That almost doesn't compute. It's like that's not really possible. Maybe the way we're organized around the idea of Thanksgiving is what makes that impossible. So let's consider that idea, if we will. Now, note that the Scripture does not say that you should be thankful for all circumstances, because circumstances can really be positive or negative, good or bad, horrible, terrible, awful, unjust. So it's clearly stated, and we don't have to be grateful for all circumstances, but the challenge is, the directive is to be somehow grateful in all circumstances. So do you see that distinction? Is it possible to be grateful in each circumstance? Some days that's a challenge. It's a real challenge. Again, because we're kind of welded to view life, view our perspective, view what's going on, we're kind of forced to tie that to what's actually happening. It's a normal thing. We're just kind of trying to expand that idea just a little bit. So to be grateful or to be thankful in all circumstances is somehow our challenge. I actually believe that is doable. I think it's possible. I do think it's a mindset. I do think it's an attitude. I do think it's a perspective, way more than it's anything else. And how is that perspective developed? How could we possibly be grateful at certain times in our life? I mean, you can connect to this pretty readily, right? I mean, it's like this chapter you probably did not envision, didn't plan for it, wasn't the idea, not the intention, wasn't anything about it, and so how in the world this is, this time in my life, here I'm in recovery, I'm in this facility, trying to learn to live in a way differently, trying to do all of these things. How could I possibly be grateful in all things? Well, you don't even have to say words, because you can feel that. I mean, you have a sense of that. We're certainly not grateful for everything that happened, but the circumstance that you find yourself in right now, you can connect to some gratitude. I think it's just possible. My mindset, may stop me from doing that sometimes, but if I can be still, if I can open up to consideration, if I can slow down that narrative, that voice that's in my head. Do you have a voice in your head? Does it just scream at you? Some do, some don't. Some go, I wish I'd had a voice. That'd have helped me out a little bit. But if you can slow down and be still, I think that sense of gratitude can begin to slowly emerge as I realize that there's something at play that's much bigger than just myself. All of those days that I believed that I was somehow responsible to control the universe, that began to weigh on me. That was a little bit too big a job for me. But being in that position, truly believing that I was supposed to control the outcome of things that I could not control, that's really frustrating. And it funnels me and leads me in a direction it's pretty easy to not be grateful. When I can't control everybody else and other people, places, and things, it feels like there's nothing to be grateful for. So finally coming to a point and understanding that's not in my job description. That's way above my pay grade, that I don't have to control. I don't have to really control anything except what I do and what I say. And when I finally understood and brought it back down at least to that, I had a chance. Do I perfectly handle what I do and what I say? No, but at least it's a doable job. I've found a way to get some help with that. So this inherent idea of thanksgiving, how could we possibly be grateful in all circumstances? It reminds me of a story. You've heard it, but let's talk about it just a little bit. It's in Scripture. It's a story of a family long ago. And these scriptures, I'll remind you, were written, to a Mideastern culture. There were people that lived in what we call now the Middle East. It wasn't written to Americans, and they didn't speak English. And that's okay. It's all kind of been translated, and hopefully we can get the real story and not mess up the translation. But in those days and times, there was a family, a well-to-do family. And one of the children, one of the sons, a younger son, if you recall, had asked for his birthright. The name of the story that we've given to it is the prodigal son. That's right. I can relate to the prodigal son. Maybe you can too. The prodigal son was the name of the story, but in the culture in which that story took place, it was common for the child prior to, the passing of the father or the parents, they could request their inheritance, what they would be given at the time based on the family structure and the unit. They could request that, and they could be turned over, and they could kind of go on and maybe start their lives or whatever they would want to be. So the request is really not uncommon. Sounds kind of uncommon to us, but in that day and time it was quite common. So the younger son requests his inheritance, takes his lump sum of money and leaves the family. Story goes on, and we hear that he went and he spent his money, in ways that we can also relate to. He was younger, but he went and he spent his money just on, he was just partying. He just went. He ate, he drank, he was merry. He went anywhere he wanted to. He did anything he wanted to. He just lived it up, right? Because he had his inheritance. He had his money. Probably not the wisest of moves, as he looks back, but I can also relate to that because there's been times that I certainly did not make the wisest of moves. But he was off in a foreign land, and he was living this way, and maybe you can relate to this too. As long as I have enough to drink, as long as I got enough money, as long as I got enough dope, I got friends. It never occurred to me that those were directly proportional, that when I had all of that, I seemed to have all of these friends. When you run out of money, or you run out of something to drink, or you run out of dope, you also run out of what? Friends, or what we call, at least in treatment, using buddies. I had a passel of using buddies. But using buddies, when there's nothing to use, not gone. I didn't have very many friends, actually. And so the young man in this story has found himself in this predicament. When his money ran out and everything else, he was kind of alone. In a foreign land, he was alone. And he found himself finally, because he had to do something to survive, he found himself working, at a pig farm, tending the pigs, if you will, which in our day and time is, hey, that's not, I've had worse jobs, In fact, I worked on a pig farm when I was a migrant running through, found myself out of money in Iowa. Worked on a pig farm about a month, so wasn't the worst job I've ever had. But this is really bad for this culture. This was a Jewish culture that was in Mideastern time, and the old law that he had grown up with, his religious doctrine, a pig was classified as unclean. I mean, it was to be avoided. I mean, completely avoided. Certainly not going to eat, of a pig. But it even went further than that culturally, that they didn't want to see them, hear them, smell them, or touch them in any form or fashion. So it was, if you can believe it, it was even a moral issue, to a Jew in that day and time, to be in connection with something that's unclean. So it's a pretty big deal. Kind of hard for us to imagine it being that big, but it was. So he finds himself with the pigs. And he was tending them. He was feeding them. He was cleaning up after them. He was in close proximity. It was kind of the lowest point he could go. He was hungry. Didn't have his wages, wouldn't even feed him. So he was actually eating what the pigs did not eat, what the pigs left. I never saw a pig leave anything, to be honest with you. Not when I was working. I never went back to the trough and it's like, oh, here's some leftover. I believe I'll get me a little of that, but so I don't know if that was for emphasis of the story, like the guy had nothing to eat, because everybody knows a pig doesn't leave anything. So I don't know if that was the emphasis of the story. Doesn't really matter, does it? He was eating what the pigs left over, which might have meant nothing. It occurred to him at some point in time, and this is going to be pivotal to our ideas, it occurred to him at some point in time that even the servants at my father's house have it better than this. And so he made the decision to go back. To go back and ask for a position as a servant at his family home. Now, we could go a couple of directions with this. Certainly would take a moment of dealing with my own pride to have to do that. Position of humility. But I'm going to offer for your consideration that there was also an element, a spark at least, of gratitude, of thankfulness. Because I'm going to tell you why I believe that. The young man left his family with a pocket full of money. What brought him back to his family was what was in the other pocket. He had a pocket full of money here, but what he had over here, okay, was relationship. Some good memories. Some idea of how his family interacts with people. You with me? He had some memories. He had some relationship. He had some stuff that was good. That was in his other pocket. And his idea of gratitude kind of emerged through that filter because he knew that even the people who worked for his family, much better position or situation than I am now. And if I could just go back and get a job, hey, I can make it, I can survive. Does that resonate with you? Do you see I'm tying that to gratitude? He was grateful whether he knew it or not. He was grateful for the things in his other pocket that gave him the idea of going back. So he started his journey. That's not the only tie we can have with that story in terms of thankfulness, because if you remember, part of the story was the father. It would seem that the father would go out, okay, to the end of the road every day, and he would look off in the distance. And for some period of time, he would stand and probably, hopefully wait for his son to come home. You remember that part of the story? It seemed that he did that over and over and over, hoping that one day he would see his son coming down the road. He kept doing that. Eventually, the one day came, did it not? That one day came, he looked and he saw in a distance, and I don't know how he determined it was him. Maybe because the father knows the gait of the son's walk. I'm not sure, but he knew his son was coming down the road, was coming home. He was coming back. He left with everything that was owed him. And now he's coming back. And you remember the story enough to know what was the response of the father? Ran to meet him. He was overcome with joy, with love, with gratefulness, a grateful attitude. He was so thankful. The son probably the son anticipated maybe a cooler welcome. I could understand that. I could understand expecting a much cooler welcome than to be run and met and scooped up and celebrated and lauded, because the father was overcome, filled with what? With gratitude. My son who was gone has now returned, come back. It was connected to the situation of his son coming back. But what existed inside the father? It was this inherent attitude of thanksgiving, of gratefulness that was sparked by that event, and then it just naturally overflowed. It wasn't a choice, it wasn't an act, it wasn't a decision. It wasn't, he sat there when he saw him and said, okay, I'm going to act like this because it's probably the right thing to do. You with me? No. It just was natural. It was real. And he screams back to his servants. He says, get the fatted calf, slaughter it. We're having a celebration. We're having a huge party. So it gets put into motion, and this big celebration is going to occur. And then we got a side note. Do you remember the side note? The older brother. I think this is why it's such a good story about gratitude, because the older brother who had done what was right, stayed with the family, worked, did everything he was supposed to. All of a sudden, what do you see? Was he as grateful as the father?
No.
He wasn't. In fact, he was just a little jealous, maybe a little resentful, because after all, I'm speaking for him now, after all, I did what I was supposed to do. This person, this brother, this sister did not, yet when they come back, they're celebrating. So I want you to think about the positioning of a grateful heart. One, an overflowing abundance from a father who has a son return. Another, pretty jealous, envious, and even resentful. You see, the one who had done everything supposedly right didn't have the spirit of gratitude. The one that had all the benefits somehow took for granted the situation and held contempt, for the one who had returned. As in all stories, it's pivotal for me to find my place in the story. That's what stories are for, so I can connect. And in this one, I can tell you that I have been the prodigal. I can connect to that. I know what that feels like and smells like. I know what it's like to take those steps back. I've been the other brother too. Wished I didn't have to say that, but it wouldn't be true. I've been the other brother. I've been ungrateful and resentful, held a grudge, even projected some kind of blame upon another for circumstances that were kind of in their favor. Can you believe that? Can you believe that I would hold a resentment to another person for something good that happened to them? What's wrong with me? I've been there. I've been the father that stands and prayerfully hopes for someone to return, a loved one, a colleague, a friend, a client, a neighbor, doesn't matter. I've stood and longed to see them come down the road and have seen that. You see, circumstances don't dictate a grateful heart. A grateful heart is there. It is a part of. There's another part of Scripture that says, and it's kind of confusing sometimes, that all things can work for good to those that are called according to his purpose. Again, let's draw a clear distinction. It does not say in any form or fashion, it does not say in any way that all things are good, because all things are not good. Circumstances are not always good. But somehow the Creator can work not good for good. Above my pay grade. Don't understand how that can happen, because I know not all things are good, but somehow it can be worked for good, and so I put my faith in that idea. It can be worked for good for those called according to his purpose. So now I'm going, well, I want to be one of those. What is it to be called according to the purpose of the Great Spirit? They asked Jesus that question. He answered quite simply. Love God. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's the purpose. That's the way in which not only can I be grateful in these circumstances, but I can show gratitude. Not without me making a mental decision to do so. It just happens. I think there's a real challenge. There's a real challenge that's inherent with folks that grow up going to church, because they hear stories and they're involved in these ideas for their whole life. But I think the challenge or the danger in that is that when it comes to the gospel, it's very hard to connect. It's very hard to connect. I remember I was maybe 4 years old, maybe 3. I was in a grocery store with my mother. Honestly, I never wanted to go to the grocery store with my mother. Never really wanted to go hardly anywhere, with my mother, but I didn't have a choice. So we're in the grocery store, and she's like, stay here. I was a full 4 years old, so I don't know if you can imagine all of the opportunity for exploration that would be available to a 4-year-old in this massive thing called a grocery store. It looked huge. Well, of course, I did not stay right there, I'm wandering off, which my wife says I still do, actually. She says, you wander off all the time. Anyway, so I wander off and I'm looking, I'm running this girl, And then it kind of dawns on me that, I don't know where anybody is. I'm a full 4 years old. I'm kind of tired of exploring, and I'm ready to go, well, am I going to live here the rest of my life, or am I going to get to go home? So I start looking for my mother. You've done this, I know. So you go down these aisles, and you look down this aisle, and you go to the next one, you look down this aisle, and you go every one, and there's like vanished. She's nowhere. So I'll go all the way in the store, and then you circle back down to the other end of the aisle, because who knows, they might drop in from the ceiling. And you come back and you look every aisle, and I'm like, it's still kind of phenomenal to me that you can't run across a glimpse of somebody in the grocery store. But I didn't, and I couldn't. And I remember it hit me. I'm lost. Not really, I'm in the grocery store. But for 4 years old, I'm lost. This is it. This is it, as far as it goes. It's a pretty good 4 years. I ain't got much, but what do you expect at 4? And I remember sitting down. I just sat down. It was like under one of those frozen food things, So it's not like I'm in the middle of the aisle. This was not intentional, although I got in trouble for it. I just sat down next to that thing and go, I'm lost. She said, stay there. I didn't. I'm lost. It's over. Really didn't know if she'd come look for me or not. It gives you an idea of my mother. But she did. Of course, she found me. It seemed like, I don't know, a day or two. But she finds me. And I look back on that. I still remember the sense that I had. Because I was lost. I was lost, and she found me. I'll never forget that feeling. Well, I shouldn't say that. I don't forget it now. There was a time that I had to redo that whole story. You with me? Had to redo the whole story. But looking back on it, I go, oh yeah, I remember what it's like to be found. I offer for your consideration the trouble that people will have with the gospel and all of this kind of stuff is that a lot of people who've been at church their whole life, they don't know what it's like to be lost. And I would not give anything for that feeling. Because when I fully embraced my lostness, I could fully embrace being found. And without that, I'm not sure I know how to be grateful. But with that, you follow? I can't be anything but grateful. It's an impossibility. So as the story of our lives are continuing to be written, don't throw out your lostness. No, it's pivotal to your gratitude. It's inherent, it's inbred. Because once found, that's something that just comes out. And so I can be grateful in all circumstances because the circumstances do not dictate me being found. And like the prodigal son, as he comes back and the huge celebration, once I understand that, it changes everything. It changes everything. It's perspective. It's just in there. And so I'm eternally grateful, for all of these things that go into the chapters that are called my story. And I hope and I pray that you too are weaving those things in the most beautiful tapestry that you can imagine. Because that's what's occurring behind the scenes. You are cared for, you are loved, you are protected, and you are found. And so I hope and I pray that you embrace all of that. I'm coming back next week. If we have a next week. Well, that's too soon. Yeah. I don't know about that. But I'm coming back next week and we'll explore something about the idea that goes along with this thing called Christmas. So we can kind of talk about Thanksgiving and then about Christmas